Hey everyone, welcome back to Lookout. If you're just joining us for the first time, my name is Zeke Lunder. I run this channel to talk about forestry and wildfire issues. And this is user-supported media right here. We've been following the fires in Chile. Chile is geographically really similar to California, same latitude south as we are north, and has some real similarities climate-wise, vegetation-wise, and also forest practices down there. There's a lot of similarity between some of the forest practices there and here. And so been wanting to dig a little deeper into the causes of these big fires and the politics and some of the history. So we're going to have a few videos here talking to people that I know who've either worked in Chile or studied there or been involved in forestry. And so the first one we've got is Tracy Katelman. I met Tracy through working in wildfire resilience work here in Northern California. She's a California registered professional forester, and she's also been working in Chile for most of her career. So first in our series on Chile, Tracy Katelman. So welcome to Lookout, Tracy Katelman. Thanks for coming.
I've been going down to Chile for 30 years. I first went down as part of building the trail for the Cani Forest Sanctuary, which was the first private park in Chile. And been going ever since and ended up living there for 9 years.
Right.
So a lot I can talk about in all those 30 years of experience, for sure. And in terms of what's happening in the fires in Chile is that it's important not to put our own, not to get too much caught in what's going on or the fires that we see here in California and applying that there, because it's pretty different.
Okay.
Mainly, it's not a fire-adapted ecosystem, so that's a huge difference, especially down in the south where a lot of the fires are.
Not fire adapted. So does that mean just that like humans haven't been starting fires, or the forests weren't traditionally receptive to fire spread, or what?
I think it's the latter. And I think that, as you know, that indigenous burning is a big part of our forest evolution, let's say, in California, that's less so there.
Okay.
It's not like people think about slash and burn. That's not, that's happened some, but I would say that's happened more since colonization. Yeah, the Mapuche people, that's not the way they manage their forests and live in their forests. Fire has not been a big part of that, as it is here.
But the forest, the climate and the forest weren't really it's not like ponderosa pine or something where...
It's temperate rainforest. It's a lot wetter. And the interesting thing is that it's predominantly a hardwood forest, nothofagus. So tan oak is our one nothofagus species up in North America. You get down to that region and it smells like tan oak. Like somebody came and visited recently. It's like, oh, it smells like Willow Creek. Mm-hmm. So it's predominantly hardwood with some conifers. We have Manillo is a yew, and the Alerce is a little further south, which is the cousin to the redwood. But otherwise, it's mainly hardwoods and wet, very wet in the south. And that, the region where the fires are happening it's a transition zone in there where you're getting from the warmer northern forests or northern ecosystems down into the damper, cooler, temperate rainforest. Okay. So most of where the fires are burning are on the coast, and that's why I was asking you on Twitter, let me know if you see any ignitions that happen up in the Andes, because that's where most of the native forests are. But otherwise, most of that landscape that you're seeing on the west side of Chile, I think the west side of the Central Valley in California is primarily plantation. It's been converted from native forest.
When the fires get to the native forest, do they lay down, or are they really destructive?
Depends on conditions, right? So when it's hot and windy, no. I went to this workshop on quinoa, and this older Mapuche woman got up and was speaking about how they have no more water to grow their dawe, their quinoa, because of all the plantations that have come up around them, around their traditional lands, have sucked all the water out of the hillsides. And so it's a survival thing for a lot of folks.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they don't have the water to raise their food and water their animals that are their basic survival. It's complicated. I was thinking about it this morning. If people are interested in the history, I would recommend reading Isabel Allende, the dictatorship and what happened there, and land got taken from people and put into these larger corporate holdings. And in the case in this region, a lot of that was the forest industry, Arauco, Mininco. And Chile basically went with, I think it was the Chicago School of Economics and Berkeley forestry models back then, in terms of capitalism and corporate forestry and plantation forestry.
I guess I am drawing these connections between what we're seeing here with SPI losing huge tracts in single days and this feeling that, like, man, this is really not panning out. When you plant a plantation, you're planting this asset that's vulnerable for its entire life.
It's amazing here. You probably saw it when you were there. I was just there a few weeks ago. Down in Chile, like Doug firs get harvested after like 20, 30 years. They grow so fast. They grow a meter at least in a year, several feet. And so they have these really quick rotations, and it's pretty intensive. And it has a big impact certainly on both the wildlife, but also the folks who've been living there for generations. Mm-hmm. And there are people who, the dictatorship is so complicated. And the culture, it's an interesting culture in this padron culture of not speaking back, doing what you're told, but that the power, it's this interesting work ethic down there. Actually, we did this conservation GIS project down in Patagonia in Tierra del Fuego back in 97. I was Esri's conservation GIS mentor for Chile. And we got money from Patagonia, and we the plan was to do this mapping of the big areas for protection, right, down through the whole Patagonia region in Chile and Argentina. And we got funding and hired some guy who everybody said that he was the guy down in Punta Arenas. And it ended up he spent most of his time playing video games because I was up here. I was running the project theoretically. And it was part of the culture of like it's how much you can get away with, because that padron culture of the only power you have is what you can get away with, right? And I think that ties into, people lighting fires are feeling powerless, and that's a way that they have power. So it's really complicated.
Yeah. I guess I felt that. I was there, I was like 28 or something, with my brother, and we were just kind of riding around on buses and hitchhiking and backpacking and bumming around. But I just, it was really hard to understand people. People mumbled, and like they give directions, they just kind of mumble and wave. And like we spent a lot of time just lost. And then later I was thinking like that, wow, is that like mumbling and kind of, is that just a way that people came to survive because if you spoke up, you got executed by the regime? And I just,
before that,
yeah, and I felt like you could just feel that trauma, like in people just didn't want to talk that much. They wanted to kind of talk about the weather and food, but they didn't want to talk. No one wanted to talk about much more than that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, the dictatorship ended late 80s, and that's not very long ago. Mm-hmm. And definitely, our generation felt that impact in a big way. A lot of folks got moved to other parts of the world and then came back. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were in Puerto Montt, and I was wearing like a red bandana. It was kind of windy, and I put on this red bandana, and I was like walking down the street. And I went back to the hostel, and the guy who was in the hostel, he had like pictures of Allende on his wall, and he got really pissed, and he's just like, you effing Americans, like you're just walking around with this like red socialist bandana on, like it's no big deal, when like we've had to hide for our whole lives, and our friends all got killed for, and you're just walking around like it's no big deal. And I wasn't even thinking that like wearing a red bandana was like a statement. I was just like, my ears were cold because it was windy. But he got really mad at us, and I was just like, wow, like I'm just an idiot walking, like I'm just an idiot tourist here. But he just felt like I think that I was like bringing trouble to his house by like being this dude walking around with a red bandana walking into his hostel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's still very less so in the last 10 years, 15 years. It's less so, but certainly when I was traveling through Chile in the 90s, you could feel a lot of that tension.
Mm-hmm.
And, people told me like family members would turn each other in, and it's just like, it's hard to imagine living like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
What that was like. So then fast forward a few decades, and here we are, and people are feeling powerless.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been many years of drought, and a lot of people, a lot of development, a lot of people, especially during COVID, like I said, Pucón, this tiny little town. When I first went to Pucón in 1993, the main drag was gravel. Mm-hmm. And now there's 50,000 people, and 20,000 of them moved there in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing a lot more people moving into the WUI all throughout Chile.
Mm-hmm.
So that's having a big cultural as well as ecological impact, right?
Mm-hmm. So
the rain drought.
Right. So first we made the WUI magnitudes more dangerous, and now we've got people moving into it.
Yeah. And, I have hope because people, there's still, at least in the South, what we call the South of Chile, which is, I don't even know where that officially starts, but definitely south of Santiago. There's definitely still a strong community spirit, energy. And they have what are called the Junta de Vecinos, the Association of Neighbors. And they're you have official standing as a Junta de Vecinos. So on the road that I live on, we've had the Junta de Vecinos there for a long time. And we have these monthly meetings and talk about things like fixing our road or potable water or whatever. And then also we have the Ronda Médica, like they'll have, doctors come through, things like that. So there's a structure there in place that's semi-governmental, semi-official. So I feel like there's a lot of possibility for community organizing in Chile that's harder to do here. Mm-hmm. Like there's a network and a way to get information out, and people in a lot of places, at least where I've been, still rely on each other heavily. Mm-hmm. So that gives me hope.
Okay, so I noticed, like, is anyone using fire at all for forestry down there, for burning slash or site prep or anything else?
Yeah. Quema controlada. Definitely CONAF has been working with people on that for years. Some people do it with permits, some don't. Yeah, so people do that around their homes. They do it in agriculture. They do it in forestry. But it's not like here in California where we're trying to get, a natural ecosystem process back. It's a way of managing fuel.
Yeah, it's agricultural.
Generally.
Okay, it's the weed eater.
And I don't know how, it's a good question. I don't know how much they're using it in the plantations. I haven't thought about that.
I noticed in the FSC certification that you're supposed to keep fire out of your lands. That's like one of the conditions of it, is that you have a fire prevention program and that you minimize the use of fire.
I was one of the founders of FSC, by the way back when.
So can we say that these forests are sustainable if they burn up? The
plantations? No.
Mm-hmm. And there's
no. They've just I haven't paid attention to what's happened with FSC Chile and the plantation certification. They've been able to use FSC to move the needle a little bit, but they're not sustainable. They require so many inputs to maintain them. Mm-hmm. But profits are not going to the communities at all.
I thought a lot about that after the Dixie Fire, because we held Collins Pine up as this model of sustainable forestry, and then they lost 50,000 acres in like 3 days, and they were certified sustainable. And I just thought, well, have we totally been caught off guard here? Has forestry been caught off guard? How can we say that this is a sustainable operation if we're not putting fire on the ground? If we don't maintain these fire resilient conditions. And so I guess I have the same question in Chile. It's okay. We've got like 6 million acres in Chile that are certified sustainable, but obviously they're not if they can't take fire, if they can't go through a drought without all burning up. So how do we, does it mean anything?
Well, again, that they can't take fire in Chile is a lot different than taking fire in California. So it's really a different situation in terms of fire and fire ecology. And I think with any industry, it's like, how do you deal with natural disasters? I don't like to use that term, but how do you deal with disasters, right? And how do you plan for that? And certainly when we started FSC, we weren't thinking about that. We were looking at how do we change rotations and, move more towards uneven age management and not be using chemical, poisons in the water, things like that. And that communities have rights and are not being negatively affected by forest industry near them. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize 6 million acres are certified in Chile. And again, I think that without knowing many of the details, because I haven't talked about that with anyone in probably a decade, I think that it's been that kind of incremental change that they've been working on with whoever they've certified down there. I don't think it's the end of fire season in Chile. Summer just started. February is the official month of vacations. Mm-hmm. It's the hottest month of the year. So literally this all took off the first week of summer vacation. And unlike the States, we kind of have summer vacation is June, July, August. In Chile, it's February. And so you don't get anything done in February in Chile.
Right.
And all the tourist towns are packed, mob, like Pucón, we have what they're called tacos, the traffic jams. Like my house is 20 minutes from downtown Pucón, and it can take me an hour or two to get in.
Yeah.
When there's a taco, and we've had them already when I was down there in December, January.
Yeah, we were down there.
That's
when we were down there. I went to Chiloé in February and partied with everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah, so February is summer vacation, and everybody in the South has asados, barbecues. Mm-hmm. And, if we don't get any rain, usually we get some rain. So I was just down there for 3 weeks. When I first got down there, it was right before Christmas. It was in the 80s. It was hot for where I live. My property's at 2,000 feet, right up against the volcano in the Andes. And it doesn't get hot very often up there. And it was hot. It was hot when I first got there because we had a puelche. It's the same thing. So the puelche is like a Santa Ana wind. It's the hot, dry wind comes over from Argentina. And if you're in that part of Chile, if you drive up or fly or whatever you walk, however you do it, if you go up and over to go into Argentina, there's literally, you probably saw this stark line where it's like green, 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 and then you come up to the ridge of the Andes and all of a sudden it's dry, right? Rain shadow, amazing difference. Mm-hmm. So these hot, dry winds come from Argentina, the puelche, and usually when the puelche starts, like 3 days later, you get rain. That didn't happen this time when I was there. Like I hardly got any rain when I was down there in 3 weeks, which is not rare, but unusual. And, but the temperature dropped. So then it was probably in the 70s, upper 70s. But then now it was pushing 40. So it was 90s, 100s. Like that's hot for there and dry. I can't remember the tangent I was going on there, but so it's summer. Mm-hmm. And so all these people are going to be going down there and renting all these cabins and houses all over the place, all through the South, but in the Pucón area especially, and doing their asados. And we could get a lot more fire starts. Mm-hmm. Luckily, people, this was a bit of a wake-up call, so people are talking about it. But we'll see. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say it's over.
Okay. Yeah, so looking at the 2017 maps, there's a lot of land got burned, and then these fires have burned 500,000 acres so far. And so I just wonder, like, at what point do you, like, so SPI lost like 45,000 acres of kind of mixed tree farm and stuff they hadn't gotten to turning into a tree farm yet in a single day during the bear fire here in Butte County. And I think I've kind of the same question down there. It's like, well, at what point, what's the tipping point? We're like, okay, if we burn up 600,000 to a million acres every 5 years, it doesn't take long for that 6 million acres of certified forest to be 2 million acres. Or, here, it seems like it's more of a question like, how can you keep your mill open in Quincy when you've burned all the private forest land within 50 miles of the mill? And so I guess it sounds like you're not as connected right now into the kind of day-to-day of forest management down there, but I'm curious, like, what conversations the big owners are having and how maybe they're changing practices to address this kind of issue that maybe they weren't thinking about when they set up their companies 30 or 40 years ago.
Well, again, they're a lot shorter rotation, so the impact is probably going to be less than what we'd see up here. And I'll be curious. I haven't had a chance to dive in to your maps and others that much, but I'll be curious, like, what, were the younger rotation or the younger forests that have burned. Although it's all pretty young if you compare it to what we have here, and certainly the pine and eucalyptus are really flammable.
So what kind of mitigations, like, are, here we talk about these fuel breaks and kind of landscape scale fuel treatments. Does the nature of the ownership down there lend itself at all? Like, are people thinking that way? Are there areas where you've got like a strategic ridgeline and they're thinning it?
So I mentioned we were doing this project with CONAF back in 2015 called Comunidad Preparada. It's basically, we're taking the kind of the Community Wildfire Protection Plan Fire Safe Council model from California and looking at how to apply that down there. And we did, we worked in 5 or 6 different communities that were all pretty unique, both geographically and culturally. So one of the communities was called Mininco. Literally, the town name was the same as the company name. And this is in the area where it's definitely burned. I'm sure it burned in 2017, and it's burning around there now. And so it's a company-owned town, and everybody that lives there works for the mill, or somebody in the family does. And they showed us, Maninco showed us all the work they'd done in terms of creating these fuel breaks along the edges of their property and up around communities. So the industry is looking at that, and CONAF has a program called Silvicultura Preventiva, preventative silviculture, where they're basically encouraging fuel breaks. So working with the industry, CORNMA is the industry association, working with them to create these fuel breaks between industry and communities to try to mitigate those fires so there's less damage on the communities. I haven't seen that practice being implemented around native forests. And if it was, it would be to protect the native forests from the communities, whereas these others are to protect, well, probably both ways. I'm sure the industry puts them in to protect their plantations from communities, as well as the communities from future fires coming in from the plantations.
Right.
But a lot of the work that's been happening then in that program, and there's apparently a couple hundred communities now that they've done this program with, is organizing people to teach them about how do you live with fire and how do you prevent fire is a big part of it in Chile. It's preventing the ignitions, right? Because almost all fires are human started in Chile. And then how to create defensible space and how to have safe places and how to evacuate and how to create. So we have talked about creating fuel breaks along evacuation routes, things like that.
So switching gears a little, who buys the wood from Chile? Like, what's the kind of, where does Chile fit into the kind of global timber industry, and what kind of processing? Are they selling logs? Are they selling
Pulp?
Is it all like
a lot of pulp, and it used to go a lot to China. I assume it's the same.
And then are they exporting any like milled lumber?
I doubt it. Maybe a little bit,
Mhm.
but I,
So with those
I
fast
mean,
rotations, they're not like worried about like wood quality. They're just looking at grow
well, they
volume.
grow wood. They sell wood locally.
Mhm.
My house is built out of Doug fir that was grown on a neighbor's smaller plantation tree lot.
And it,
It's interesting too, though, that we would consider they overbuild in Chile. So like my house, when they were framing it, it was like 1 foot centers, like it was just all these squares, Doug fir, just like lots of Doug fir. Um, so I assume, well, mainly they say that that's for earthquakes, right? So when I was there for the 2010 earthquake, we had it. And that's another thing I was thinking, looking at the maps today, Lebu and Loten, those areas over by Concepcion where the fires are happening is where the epicenters of the big earthquakes have been. There's a lot going on over there.
mhm.
I know it was an 8.0 down by our house, and my whole house just moved with it. 3 full minutes of an 8.0, and it just kind of moved with it because that's how they build. But I suspect that part of that too is because the timber quality is probably not as good. But if you overbuild, you kind of make up for it.
Okay. So were there big North American companies that were involved in kind of the startup of the industry down there?
Yeah. LP and Simpson, which is now Green Diamond. I remember in the 90s, basically, well, it was both of them basically got kind of, no, it was LP. LP got chased out of California during the timber wars, and they came down to Chile and opened up a big pulp mill near Puerto Montt and others.
So in some ways, like the growth of the industry down there has been driven in part by like us shutting down logging on public lands in North America.
Likely. I think you can make that argument in terms of an economic opportunity that the Chilean industry
So did they
took
buy
advantage.
land? Did Simpson and LP did they actually hold land, or did they come down and just buy wood from companies that were established and run mills
I
for
don't
pulp?
remember. That was in the 90s, dude. I don't remember that far back. Boise Cascade, I remember that there was a big campaign against Boise back then as well. I think they
Okay.
went down for the mill capacity, is what I remember. Because they're not the names of who owns the land, right? That's
Right.
Arauco, CMPC, Mininco.
I thought it was interesting what you said about the UC Berkeley Forestry School and the Chicago School of Economics. You know, kind of this being the brainchild of two of our kind of best and brightest academic institutions. And where did you go to school for forestry?
I went to Berkeley.
I look a lot at the Google Earth here and around where I live, California, and I see just SPI's clear cuts for the entire landscape from Yosemite to the Oregon border. And I
Mm-hmm.
think like this is the product of this is UC Berkeley, right? This is like our best and brightest um, thinkers
Yeah. Yeah.
from the last 100 years on matters of land management and forestry. This is they came up with this, and like a ton of
Well,
Cal
actually, they
grads
would
are working
say
for
that
SPI.
it started out of Germany, right? And that whole model.
Right. But our best and brightest have like kind of SPI's following the science and advice of our kind of best academic forestry
So
programs, right? Like when you look at like who works for SPI, it's like Cal, Humboldt, Cal Poly, and but it's all just burning up. Like it's not working out, and I just wonder how much navel gazing. I think I see that like Berkeley now is kicking out fire ecologists, and but to me it's striking to hear you say that plantation forestry in South America is the brainchild of the Chicago School of Economics and the Berkeley School of Forestry.
that was all what Pinochet was, encouraging back then.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he thought. Let's get the best and brightest from the states, and obviously the CIA was part of it all.
Uh-huh. So how's
For
that?
the record,
I
I
mean,
didn't get a forestry degree at Berkeley. I was in the forestry department, but I was doing landscape ecology.
all right. Well,
But I
so
am a
how?
forester.
Yeah. So how does it feel when you hear me say that? Like, what does that bring up for you?
Um, I agree. I mean, I think that the dominant paradigm in forestry doesn't work. That's why we started the Forest Stewardship Council, back in the '90s and things like that. That we have to find a way to make it. I mean, I don't even like using the word sustainable because I don't think it. I don't, how do we define what's sustainable and for who and for what processes? Are we talking about ecological processes or what? Berkeley's starting to get caught up, and certainly in the last 20 years, they've made some good strides. It's great to see, the folks that are graduating now have more holistic views
Hmm.
on forest management than when I was there. But I certainly I don't take any ownership or feel like, oh, Berkeley, we were bad. I mean, it was very short sighted. And I've been pretty outspoken about that for a few decades.
Uh huh. I feel like one of the things that is kind of driving me crazy is just that even the people that didn't want to practice even age silviculture are being forced into it now by these huge fires. You know, the Collins pines and Beatties, and are faced with 50,000 acre burn scar that is always now going to be the same age moving forward. And
No,
um,
that's not true. I mean, well, I mean, there are ways you can go in and start diversifying the structural diversity, all that kind of stuff.
if it survives,
If it survives, chances are, if there's not a lot of fuel, hopefully it will.
yeah. Well, and I think we're learning a lot of lessons about reforestation, how not to do it. You know, just in burning up our plantations that we've put in the last 30 or 40 years. But our track record is so poor with, at least on public lands, of actually following up. We plant all these trees, we don't cut the brush, we don't thin the plantations, and then they burn again before we can even think about cutting a 2x4.
Right. Well, Ben, you and I talked after, I think it was after campfire, and it was obvious how much of the industrial lands burned, those plantations, and you were talking about how we took away that tool of broadcast burning from the industry, but there was so much more going on then back during the timber wars in the 80s and 90s, because what we would see then, especially on the coast, where our friends like Maxam would come in and clear cut and then burn and then spray and just take out the ability of the soil to do anything, right? Just kill the long-term soil capacity. And so those treatments basically got taken out of the toolbox then. And maybe that was too extreme. I don't know. We want to be bringing broadcast burning back into timber management, but how do you do it in a way that's not that quote scorched earth policy?
Mm-hmm. So, what does the FFC have to say about burning slash after harvest?
I don't know. Like I said, I haven't been involved in FSC in a long time, and the whole when we set up FSC, the idea was that it was site specific because you can't make a policy that says you can't burn everywhere when in some places like we're seeing in California you need to be burning, right? So that's why we had regional standards, and then the original model was to have the local communities be involved in the certification. So it was way more down on the ground, local site conditions. Economics have made it such that there are more um, certifiers, larger certifiers from around the world. And some of them are doing a good job of working with local communities, and others maybe less so. Also, when the FSC started, part of that was also to get out ahead of the industry self-certifying. So if you remember, that was happening in the early 90s. Sustainable Forestry Initiative, I think it was called.
Mm-hmm. It's still around, right?
Probably. Yeah.
Yeah. SPI, SFI.
Yeah. So that was the idea of having third-party monitors, which was the Forest Stewardship Council model.
So do you feel like forestry's been caught off guard by wildfire, by the speed with which this change is happening?
Yeah, I think so.
Mm.
I mean, I think a lot of us are not surprised, but I would say the industry in general was, yeah, not ready.
How did that happen? How did we not really see this coming?
Well, part of it is probably the climate deniers. And when I was back at Berkeley in the 80s and early 90s, John Hart was talking to us about climate change. I remember being at Old Growth Forest Ecology Conference in Corvallis in 89, I think it was. And somebody gave a presentation on climate change and said, in 50 years, all these forests could be chaparral. And the whole place went silent. Like, I remember that moment. We were all just like, how do you even deal with that information, right? How do you deal with when you're thinking about, and that was a time when we were thinking about spotted owls and Marber murrelets and the timber wars, and like going from there to these ancient forests could all be chaparral. Like, how do you plan for that? It's such a complex problem. It's a lot of people's attitude is deny it. Like, I just can't even deal with that, right?
Mm.
And then a lot of others of us worked on, okay, so how do we start building for resilience? How do we start planning for that kind of stuff? And how do you build diversity into the landscape? Diversity at all levels, right? At the landscape level, all the way down to the stand level.
Mm-hmm.
And taking some of, that forestry built on that agricultural model, we'll learn from them, the Dust Bowl, right? If you're not ready and you've got monocultures of everything, you can get wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there probably was a lot of arrogance as well of people like, oh no, that's not going to happen to us.
Mm-hmm.
We've got this. We've got the brightest minds, right?
Right.
So we've got this. Yeah, I think that's, it's a combination of human arrogance and denial of, it's just too complex of a problem to take on.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just keep doing what we're doing or make it a little better on the surface.
Right.
Or maybe, I'll be retired by then, right?
Right.
I mean, that's kind of scary, but I suspect there's some truth there.
How cheery is this?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
what do we do now?
Forests and fires in Chile and California. Yeah. It's intense stuff.
Yeah. What are you working on right now that gives you hope, or that makes you feel like good about what you do?
I'm working in Napa, but also in Yolo and Solano counties and helping for people to organize and be prepared and learn to live with fire. And I think it's a cultural shift and that's starting to happen. And that there's a lot of money coming down and amazing projects happening. So that gives me hope.
What kind of projects are you thinking it's raining money right now for fire resilience. Where do you want to see that money land? What do you think is the most impactful place for us to spend money on living with fire?
I think we have to implement all three tenets of the cohesive strategy. I don't think there's any one solution, right? I told you my academic training was in landscape ecology, and so I'm interested in seeing resilient landscapes and forest restoration. I got involved in fire because after the timber wars, fire was the way to talk to people about forest restoration and where do we go forward, right? And that's basically what a lot of these field treatments are. If we do them in a, I don't want to say right or correct because that's judgmental, but if we do them in an ecologically appropriate way, a lot of these field treatments are forest restoration. So I'm managing a big project over in Napa that's really cool, beautiful place up on Howell Mountain Ridge. That's this really amazing ecotone between the drier eastern forest and veg types, and then we have a little bit of redwood and Doug fir.
Is that up in Angwin?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, yeah, that is a cool forest up there.
Yeah.
We've been working on some wineries up there doing fuels work.
Nice. Yeah, so that's a cool and inspiring project. And then so Napa Firewise is when I say amazing, it's because of the scale, the pace and scale. Napa Firewise is just busting it. I was just calculating. I think we've raised over $26 million in the last couple of years, and we're doing treatments all over the community, a lot of small treatments. And they've gone from 12 to 20 fire safe councils, and we're doing all this defensible space and talking about home hardening, and as well as a lot of community education. So approaching it from all those different angles is inspiring. And then coming over here to Yolo County to see how the Yolo Fire Safe Council has just took off in the first week. They started in 2020 maybe, and it's really happening. I've been working up in the Cape Valley with the local folks up there, kind of as my local fire safe council, really inspiring. So that's what gives me hope, is that seeing people get it and, jump in and make changes.
Yeah, Cape Valley. If you can't be motivated to get good with fire in Cape Valley, it's like those people have had plenty of fire.
Yeah, we have a lot of fire up here.
Where do you live?
I'm in Woodland right now.
Right.
I came down here when I came to do the state fire safe council job.
Right.
I just had to stay down here for a while.
Are you working on the Solano CWPP?
Not on the CWPP. I'm working with the RCD on getting the fire safe council going.
All right.
And just watching in the last 2 years or year even, the changing attitude about prescribed fire. When we first started to talk to folks in Solano, they're like, no, we're never going to be able to do prescribed fire here. Now they're like, how can we get prescribed fire going?
Yeah, there's this contagion. All of the work that's happening in Sonoma County is just like pouring out. I feel like we're setting up these little hubs that we can just like have our prescribed fire mojo just kind of ooze out. So like we got Buchanan, we got Sasha's stuff going on. We got, let's like have these little hubs here where like driving distance to a burn. Everyone should be like driving, you should be able to drive an hour and a half from your house and burn anywhere in California, right?
That's about how far I have to drive usually if I want to go jump on one, but we've been having more here.
Right. And then so next year, then you drive an hour, and like I think we should have a 5-year plan where like 5 years from now, you can just burn in your yard, right? You don't have to drive to one of our events.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of my fun projects is I'm working on helping start the Yolo PBA.
Great.
I was part of the Humboldt one. I was one of the founding board members up there. So that's definitely where I have fun.
Yeah.
And inspiring.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. It's that cultural shift.
Yeah.
So that's what gives me hope, is that, in a lot of places, I think about the Mediterranean countries, especially where people had generations to adapt to fire and build their houses, or maybe just since forever, right? Fire's always been a part of the system there. And so they build their houses to not burn, things like that. And in California, we're trying to basically compress hundreds, 500s, millennial, how many years into a decade or less of like making this cultural shift. Right. And so that's inspiring, is to see the changes happening, at least here where I'm living in this region.
Yeah. Well, it seems like that kind of dovetails back into what you're talking about with the vecinos in Chile, where you've got community organization and established.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the tough problems here in the foothills, especially in Butte County, is just like the social fabric is so ripped here by the cannabis industry and multi-generational poverty and recent genocide of the native people. It's like, it's really hard for us to get people together around anything. And so you throw wildfire on top of just another layer in this real social, broken social dynamic we've got. So I agree that rebuilding the community fabric is kind of foundational to getting anything done for the community.
Yeah, I would say Lake County's got a lot of those same issues. Humboldt's interesting in that we have some of the same dynamics, but there's a lot of social capital in Humboldt County.
Yeah.
But then this is super cool. How do I prepare my home and its surroundings for wildfire? And so this is a great book where we have, what is defensible space? And we include some stuff about hardened home, casa fortalecida contra incendios forestales, how to prune trees, all that kind of stuff. And then we include what's called ordenamiento territorial, land use planning. Like, how do you deal with land use planning? How do you think about all this How do you prepare for emergencies, evacuations, all that stuff? So it's all in here. And I've been sharing this with a lot of people, and this is getting shared around a lot right now. It's on CONAF. It's CONAF, so it's on their website.
It's tough. I feel like we've been, in my career, I've seen the Fire Safe Council put out Living with Fire newspaper insert every couple of years. There's a grant, and they get $50,000 to print 100,000 copies or whatever, and then we're still burning up all our communities. And it's every time I see that flyer now, I'm just like, oh man, it's another year, another batch of flyers, and we still burn up 3/4 of the forest land in Butte County. It's hard to stay excited about that stuff for me right now.
But hopefully, what if it means that, 10 families survived or 100 families survived that because they read that and took it into consideration? Or however many, right?
Yeah, we're at the epicenter here, Butte County. Like, it's a lot to try to keep chipper about, or to. But yeah, I think it's helpful to remember that the rest of the world isn't quite as bad off as we've had it here.
Yeah, I mean, the difference in Napa obviously is there are a lot of resources.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I hope it makes a difference. It's hard going through this here and just seeing that, like, all those efforts, and we still lost, 90% of the homes in Paradise.
Yeah, I get it. I definitely get it. What is it that Don talks about?
Nostalgia.
Solastalgia.
Yeah. Ecological grief. Yeah, it's so thick.
It's real. And when we had that big fire, the last big fires in Chile in 2017, I've been trying, actually, let's see, it was 2008 or 9. I was trying to convince Pucon to do a fire plan, to do a CWPP. And they were interested, and then they dropped the ball. And then, a few years later, we did this project with CONAF, and we did one of the first model communities was Tinquilco, which is up the hill from Pucón near Parque Nacional Huequehue. And when I was down there this time, a friend of mine, the city council person, she's like, we really need to do a fire plan. This was a month ago. And she talked to the risk manager, and we agreed, okay, well, let's talk in March because nothing happens in February, and this was January. Mm-hmm. And now I suspect that that's going to move pretty fast. Mm-hmm. There'll be a lot of political momentum now to do it.
You got to grab it while it's there. Like, I feel like we're kind of starting. Butte County, the interest is already kind of fading.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure after a couple of years.
Yeah. We had the bear fire there that kind of jumped it for 2 years, but it rains money, it pours money, and especially if it rains for the next 3 winters, and we have some slow years, a lot of the people who are impacted move away. And
I mean, we're going to have a lot of flashy fuels, right? So we'll see.
Well, it's hard to see how it ends down there. Do you feel like there's structural changes you could make in the industry that would make their plantations more resilient, or are we always going to have that tension of, like, we got to maximize volume of production, and we're just going to have losses and we're going to absorb them somehow in our economics?
I suspect it's more towards the latter, and they will. I mean, they've already staffed up. They all have their own private firefighting crews. Mm-hmm. I suspect they'll keep looking for technical solutions like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw that the World Bank gives them a lot of money for firefighting and encourages them also to plant a bunch of conifers. I mean, is there a lot of carbon offsets being sold in Chile that are being sold, to European companies or European governments?
I think so. I think that I remember that was starting to happen like 10 years ago. Yeah, I think that the Chilean forestry model is not sustainable. Big swaths of plantations in what was a traditional landscape.
Mm-hmm. Exposed to dry, hot summer winds.
Yeah, and a lot more people driving down dirt roads, dragging chains, whatever it might be. And a lot of people feeling really powerless and pissed off.
What's your forestry story? How did you?
My forestry story is I was I did my undergrad at Berkeley in conservation resource studies, and my mentor there was Arnold Schultz, who actually worked with Harold Biswell, and he decided that he and my grandmother met and decided that I should go to grad school, and he wanted me to come and work under him, and he was in the forestry department. He was a forest ecologist, a systems ecologist, really. And so I came. Well, actually, first I did a sabbatical with him in Greece, where we were looking at traditional agroforestry systems, which was really fascinating in Greece. And then I came into grad school in the forestry department, and mainly I was going to study agroforestry, and then I realized I was in one of the best forestry schools in the world, so I decided that I would focus on old growth forest ecology and landscape ecology. And so I did that, and out of that, I got involved up in Humboldt in the timber wars, and I was working for the Rainforest Action Network, actually in San Francisco, when we started the Forest Stewardship Council. So I got involved with the certifications up there. And so when I came up to Humboldt, I started meeting with folks up there about doing certification. And we started a nonprofit called the Institute for Sustainable Forestry, and we got like some early CAL FIRE grants, like teach people about forest management and all that kind of stuff. And we had several foresters that were our advisors, because under California law, you can't teach people about doing forestry unless you have an RPF reviewing everything. And so we're doing all this literature and public education around it. And my partner, Walter Smith, who was a logger, he and I were doing a lot of the work with Forest Stewardship Council. He was studying, they were talking to him about taking the test. And then Craig Blanco, this awesome forester from Mendocino County, is like, well, why don't you take the RPF exam? I was like, me, a forester? And I took it and I passed first time, which blew me away because the pass rate was like 23% then. So I got my license, and pretty soon after that, I started working in actually the fire stuff, like coming out of the timber wars. And I was involved with the Watershed Center and the folks. We were doing a lot of economic development after the timber wars. How do we do value-added products by restoring forests using the hardwoods? What can we do to rebuild our communities after the timber wars, and what is sustainable forestry and all that? And then started talking about fire. It was Laura Chapman was working at the Forest Service, and I was living out in the Mattole then, working with the Mattole Restoration Council. And she's like, "You guys should write a fire plan." And we were like, "What's that?" And so we wrote this fire plan. All of a sudden, it got national attention, and I was talking to people about fire, and it was amazing out in the Mattole and Petrolia how it brought people together, and how it really helped rebuild that community.
Yeah, I feel like that. I've worked in fisheries and watershed planning and kind of working. I feel like both fisheries and fire are these great unifying topics where everyone wants fish in the river. No one wants their town to burn down, and we can put aside our partisan politics a lot of the time, especially in the more rural areas.
Absolutely.
So
And I think that's why the Mattole Restoration Council was so perfectly placed to help lead that fire stuff, because we'd already been doing watershed fish work for 25
right.
years. So we had some standing in the community in that way.
So how do we expand on that? How do we, right now, not everyone has a Mattole Restoration Council or a Mid-Klamath Watershed Council or a Salmon River Restoration Council. And those folks have spent, 30, 40 years building the kind of social networks to do the work. How do you see us doing that in places that don't have that kind of DNA of community organizing and activism?
Firesafe councils. That's why I got involved. So out of all that work, I got onto the California Firesafe Council board in the early 2000s. And then I went to Chile. And then when I came back, and in Chile, we really pushed that model, like I was telling you about with the Junta de Vecinos. And then I came back and came down here to help lead it. Unfortunately, California Firesafe Council Board of Directors is not very well in touch with what's going on the ground. But the model is beautiful. It's magic because you create a fire safe council for where you live. It doesn't have a structure that's already pre-assigned, right? It's like build it for where you are and make it work for where you are and bring people together with the unifying theme of how do we work together to survive the next fires? How do we take care of each other and how do we prepare our community?
I feel like, I've worked a lot with fire safe councils over the last 25, 30 years. And I just feel like the whole public money, CEQA planning cycle, that we couldn't invent a much more inefficient way to get work done on the ground. And I wish, that we had a Jeff Bezos or someone could give Forest Ranch $100 million and we'll solve the problem. But I don't see this model, this public funding of community scale vegetation management. I just don't see it. Seems terribly inefficient to me. And I just don't, I mean, what do you think of that? I feel like there's so many
I agree.
excuses and so many obstacles, and we spend all this money on planning. I've written dozens of fire plans, and still we've burned up my whole homeland and all of Butte County. And I'm sick of planning. I'm sick of like hearing people say like, "Oh, well, you have to get CEQA done for that." And then like, I just had a meeting today with our local VMP coordinator for Cal Fire, and he's like the 15th VMP coordinator we've had in the last like 16 years, right? And so I don't know. I'm pretty jaded on like this whole idea that okay, you write your CWPP, you ask for grant money, and then you spend the next 10 years on CEQA, and like we're burning piles in the Moonlight Fire right now. That fire happened almost 18 years ago, and we're just now burning the piles. So I love the idea of this like community based organization and building that social capital, but I think relying on public money to do the work is like it's setting us up to all burn to death.
I agree. And I think that's only a part of what fire safe councils could and should be doing. I think getting those grants and doing those big projects is important. And, like I said, in Napa, we've raised a lot of money and we're getting projects done fast there. I'm amazed how quickly we're getting stuff done over in Napa, how quickly we're moving through things. But that's only part of it. To me, the Fire Safe Council model is that community organized. It is going to door and talking to your neighbors about what is defensible space? How do you harden your home? How do you, not start fires? What do you do so that you can be part of the solution and not part of the problem? And then how do we bring people together and do PBAs where we don't have to do the permitting, right? We get a burn plan, but how do we find all those creative ways to work together to survive fire? The big grant funded projects are important, but they're only a small piece of it. To me, that's not the Fire Safe Council model. That, RCDs do that. Other people do that. And a lot of the fire safe councils are too small to manage those projects now because those projects, like you said, the CEQA has just been like, oh my God, I'm working on a VTP now, my first one in Angwin. We've got 20 treatment areas. So we're trying to really look ahead, like how do we permit a whole bunch of stuff at once? But, then getting down in the details of all the surveying we're going to have to do. And then what's the reporting? And it's not even clear, like, do you report before, during, and after? Or do you just report after? And do you just send in this completion report? And what does it even look like? Is there a form? Like, I haven't been able to get the answers to that yet, right? But we're trying to, let's also try to create it and show how it could be done. As long as we're confident that what we're doing is taking care of the critters and reducing smoke impacts, and especially watching our watersheds and sediment, minimizing sediment, all that. And then hopefully we can make that permit work for us. But it is a lot. It's a lot up front. It requires you to know a lot. It's not just anybody who can do it, for sure. But I think fire safe councils can partner with folks who know how to do that and get those kind of bigger projects done.
Yeah, I like the idea of.
And then back to our previous conversation, then the big land managers, where the big impacts are, the big landscape, how do we do that work there? How do we impact that work? There are no simple answers.
Right, yeah, fire's not waiting around for us to get our permits done.
No, not at all. and not waiting around for the industry to change its practices.
Right. Well, it feels like fire and fire insurance are like the two only players that really um, get to do what they want.
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole another conversation. I'd be stoked to talk to you again about other things all around fire.
Yeah.
But I gotta
Yep.
go
Stay in touch.
tend some children.
Yeah, I've got to finish this grant report.